This week on the Communicators, two critics of President Obama's proposals reducing cyber threats against the U.S., Marc Rotenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center and Larry Clinton of the Internet Security Alliance. This is part 3 of a month-long series on cybersecurity.
And this is week 3 of the Communicators series on cybersecurity. This week, we're going to talk with some interest groups who have a stake in cybersecurity issues. First up, Marc Rotenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. He's the executive director there, and we want to talk to him about some of the privacy concerns from the White House cybersecurity proposals. Mr. Rotenberg, when you look at what the White House has released over the past few months, earlier this summer, where do your concerns lie when it comes to privacy?
Let me begin by saying, Peter, I think a lot of what the White House has done in the proposal is actually very good. It's a complicated topic. There are a lot of different agencies that need to be consulted, and I think the White House has done a good job of coordinating across several different agencies a key issue for many Americans, which is how to ensure security in cyberspace. Of course, that having been said, there are some real privacy and civil liberties issues here. Because the White House is also claiming some new authority for the government to collect information on how people use the internet, as well as some new authority to intercept private communications. And we understand why they may want to do that, but we think when these types of activities are looked at closely, the need for clear legal standards really becomes apparent. And I would begin by saying that I think one of the key privacy concerns is that when the government takes these powers, there have to be very clear legal reasons and clear accountability and oversight.
And in response to what the White House has released, you said, or EPIC said, there should be legal standards, not voluntary guidelines.
Well, this is the key point, you see, because I think what the White House is trying to do is to address privacy and civil liberties concerns. They hear a lot about this, and I think they are genuinely recognizing that these are important issues. But at the same time, they seem to be a bit reluctant to take the type of meaningful steps we would like them to take. So, for example, you could update the federal wiretap law. I mean, it's been 25 years since there have been significant amendments to that act. People are using communication technologies in new ways, and the White House could say, in conjunction with our cybersecurity efforts, we want to update that law to make sure that it provides the same kind of protections that we tried to establish 25 years ago. You probably need some new types of oversight because you've got government collecting information in new ways, and those kinds of concrete proposals on the privacy and civil liberties side, I would say, are still missing.
And finally, before we get our guest reporter involved here, Mr. Rotenberg, you talked about some of the new authority that the White House calls for. Could you give me an example of that?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security is pursuing a new security technique, which they call first intrusion detection and then intrusion prevention. I think the name for the project is Einstein 3, and maybe we'll see an Einstein 4 soon. What they are trying to do is to identify specific activity on the internet that looks malicious, and they want to have better tools to identify that activity and to prevent it. But that technique also gives the government new ways to capture information online, and our obvious question is, how else might that technique be used? And I would say, before we go to Gotham, the other point to make in all this is we've just recently seen how governments can use these kinds of authorities in ways that cause us concern. And if this is not just, about China and its firewall that blocks access to internet websites, or even Egypt, where of course they suspended access to the internet for a period of time. But now we have the Prime Minister of Great Britain talking about limiting access to social network services. And even here in the United States, apparently the Transit Authority in the San Francisco Bay Area was able to turn off cell phone towers because they were concerned about political protests. So I think we need to recognize the significance of some of these recent developments when we're talking about this particular policy, which is probably a bit abstract to some of your viewers.
Gautam Nagesh is a technology reporter with the Hill newspaper.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Marc, you touched on this briefly, and that's the ability for the government to shut down portions or block portions of the internet. Obviously a hot topic given the protests in the Middle East and now the violence in London. This plan doesn't specifically seem to address whether or not the president can intercede. However, the White House has consistently maintained that the president does have the authority to take action in private networks under a very 1941, I believe, provision of the Communications Act. Does EPIC have any reaction to that stance by the White House?
You know, this is one of those policy debates that I think people in Washington just love. I mean, the heading for this, of course, is the internet kill switch. And the big concern that people had when they first looked at some of the proposals for cybersecurity, and I think it was actually one of the legislative proposals on the Hill, was that somehow the president would go down in the basement of the White House and sort of flip this big switch to the off position, the internet would stop working. I think realistically that couldn't happen for lots and lots of reasons. The internet is simply not designed in that way to centralize that type of control. It was interesting when it happened in Egypt last year. That was mostly because there were 4 access points to the internet that actually made it possible for the Egyptian government to do that. I don't think that would happen in the U.S. But what your question does go to, which is I think an interesting point, is what type of authorities would the president have in a genuine cyber warfare scenario? So in that sense, this mirrors some of the other debates that are taking place right now about, you know, when does the president need to go to Congress, what can he do on his own authority? And the White House does need to think about those issues because we found ourselves in a cyber war scenario. The president would have to make some decisions, particularly if the internet was you know, part of the battlefield.
I think a lot of people at home are wondering if we were to see, and fortunately that doesn't appear to be the case, but events similar to what we're seeing in London right now, or even the San Francisco transit authorities you mentioned, is that something under this cybersecurity proposal, in your view, that could take place? Could the federal government shut down portions of, say, a social media site if they felt it was being used to stoke violence?
Well, I think it would be difficult to do, but we do have some recent experience in the United States that's a bit of a warning, you might say, and that's surrounding WikiLeaks. When the U.S. government began to express concern about WikiLeaks activity, and you had Secretary of State Clinton and you had Senator Lieberman both talking about the problem there. They were also talking about, you know, companies that were providing cloud-based services to WikiLeaks, enabling support directed toward WikiLeaks, and we actually began through the Freedom of Information Act to explore the question, was the U.S. government actually putting a little bit of pressure on U.S. firms to back off support for an organization that they believe was controversial. So I think there are ways that this could happen. I don't think it would be quite so dramatic, as I said before, of cutting off access to the internet, but there are other ways to accomplish similar goals.
Now, switching gears a little bit, in your view, does this proposal seem consistent with the administration's previous actions with regards to collecting data both online and off? Because there are privacy advocates who have criticized this administration as consistently pushing to increase law enforcement's ability to access consumer individual data.
Yes, well, I think the proposal does not go as far as it should go to protect privacy. I think that's probably the view that's generally held across the privacy and consumer user community, that the White House could be doing more to promote specific legislation. The White House talks a lot about self-regulation, which is another way of saying, you know, they hope that the problem will solve itself. But I don't think most people who've experienced identity theft or read about all the recent incidences of security breaches feel that the problem is solving itself. So we would like to see them do more. To the extent that it's been consistent in not setting out a legislative agenda, I guess that's true, but not so good for us.
So Marc Rotenberg, when you read through the White House proposals on cybersecurity and you see the references to private industry and public-private partnerships, does that concern you? Well,
here what the White House is trying to do is actually manage the relationship with the private sector in a way that will maintain private sector support. So, for example, the private sector has said that they don't want a legislative mandate. They don't want the government to take over some of the critical infrastructure that they're responsible for. The White House and the Department of Homeland Security is concerned that if some of those networks, for example, the remotely operated electronic grids, let's say, or water supply or gas supply, much of this today today is now tied into the internet. And so you begin to think about scenarios where those actually become vulnerabilities. And the White House, of course, has some responsibility to safeguard those critical functions. So what they've tried to do with the private sector is say, we want to work with you. We need you to provide us information. We will provide you with information. But from the user perspective, that also creates some risk, because now you may have data about user activity moving back and forth between the private company and the government without any kind of real independent oversight. And in that relationship, we've said there has to be the consideration of the user, of the consumer.
Does the White House cybersecurity proposals, do they address penalties for privacy breaches?
They do, but in a way actually that we do not support, because part of the agreement in the proposal to get the information from the private sector over to DHS is to immunize the private sector companies that are disclosing information about their customers, about their users, from any liability. Now, if you're a user or a customer of one of these companies who's not the subject of a criminal investigation, you might wonder why your data ended up over the Department of Homeland Security. And the only real way you would have to affect some change in that practice would probably be to bring a lawsuit. So if the White House immunizes those companies, which is, by the way, very similar to what President Bush did around the Patriot Act amendments when the lawsuits were going forward charging violations of wiretap law. It's basically the internet users' rights that are being ignored.
This is the Communicators program on C-SPAN. We are in the third week of a series on cybersecurity issues. This week we're talking with Marc Rotenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Gautam Nagesh is our guest reporter.
Thanks, Peter. Marc, sticking with critical infrastructure, you spoke about some of these companies, the electric grid, but we've also heard mentioned that this will likely include financial services firms, internet service providers. That latter category in particular would probably raise some privacy concerns for consumers, given that once DHS or the federal government has access to this data, it's not clear whether or not they would be able to use it for other purposes. Is that something that EPIC is taking a look at?
Well, we have. I think the White House's instinct in this area is correct, which is to say that what they've put in their report is the goal of ensuring that the information that they gather will only be used for purposes consistent with their cybersecurity mandate, and we agree with that. But we'd like to see that set out clearly in the legislation and not to create a situation which oftentimes happens in government where they get the information for one purpose and they say, well, you know, we could also use the information because now we've got all this data for some other purposes. Maybe it's criminal investigation, maybe it's, you know, tax collection. I mean, who knows, you know, what it might be. And those other purposes might actually seem pretty reasonable at the time. But you see, when you open the gates in this way and enable this type of data flow from the private sector to the government, it's really the interests of the individual user that I think need to be safeguarded. And the way you have to do that is through legislation.
So what kind of legislation are we talking about specifically? Would you like to see warrants necessary in terms of using the data, or can you explain a little bit more?
As a general matter, we think that you do need judicial approval before you intercept private communications in the United States. That's really the core principle in the federal wiretap laws. Now, of course, we have exceptions, but you want those exceptions to occur around the edges in special circumstances. You don't want the core principle of judicial review before there's an intercept taking place to be replaced by a new core principle that says, you know, the government routinely gets access to user data from ISPs to see if there's anything they need to know about. That could easily happen over time, I think, if some of the language in the legislative proposal is not tightened up a bit.
Mr. Rotenberg, you've endorsed, or EPIC has endorsed, Senator Leahy's Personal Data Privacy and Security Act of 2011. Why are you in favor of this legislation?
Well, I think what Senator Leahy is trying to do is strengthen data breach notification. Now, this is an interesting development in the privacy world. Basically, it's the requirement that's placed on companies to tell their customers when information about them has been wrongfully disclosed. It may not be as, quite as satisfying as knowing that your information is always protected, But what we've learned increasingly is that when the user data gets out there, there are new opportunities for financial fraud and identity theft. And of course, the company is taking a bit of a hit when it has to concede that, it didn't follow adequate security practices. So Senator Leahy, through his privacy legislation, is trying to strengthen the data breach notification requirements, including some new penalties, which I think would be very good. Another issue which he has addressed, and others on the Hill as well, which is moving to the fore, I would say, in the privacy world, is the notion of data minimization, recognizing that it's oftentimes difficult to protect the information that's being collected. I think the view in the expert community and the privacy community is that increasingly companies really need to think about, is it such a good idea to collect so much information about individuals? I mean, do you really need social security numbers on your customers if you don't have tax reporting requirements? Do you really need to keep financial information? And should the information that you're keeping, should that be routinely encrypted? Those are also topics that Senator Leahy and others have looked at.
Is Senator Leahy's legislation similar to what Mary Bono Mack is pursuing?
Well, Congresswoman Mack's bill on the House side, I think, is a good starting point, but I don't think it goes as far as Congressman Rush's bill from the last Congress. One of the accomplishments of the last Congress was to recognize also the significant role that the information broker industry plays in this particular area, and the need, I think, to establish some new privacy safeguards for that industry. What Congresswoman Bono Mack felt was, at this point, she just wanted to focus on the security side without looking at the privacy issues yet. Our view is that the privacy issues need to be considered at the same time.
Final question, Mr. Nagesh.
Speaking to data minimization, we've seen a tension there between the privacy experts and many industries feel that, as you said, there needs to be as little data kept as possible, whereas on the other hand, law enforcement, and we've seen in the House a bill which under the purpose of cutting down child porn is also pushing
on that bill.
Increase. Yes, and I was at the hearing where you testified on that. Can you speak to that tension? And the White House proposal appears to be more sympathetic to law enforcement's need to be able to access information. Where do you see the proposal coming down on that divide?
I don't know what the outcome will be, but I do know, having studied the history of privacy law in the United States, that I think one of the accomplishments in our original privacy legislation was to say to law enforcement quite explicitly, you really should only collect the information that's necessary and related to the criminal investigation you're pursuing. So it is actually the case that currently in federal wiretap law there are minimization procedures and other legal obligations that help ensure that information about innocent people is not gathered. That's the change, and I don't see a reason to make that change at this time.
Marc Rotenberg is the Executive Director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. How is EPIC funded?
You know, I've been struggling with that issue for a long time. We don't take money from the private sector, and we don't take money from the government, so we basically get contributions from individual donors, some of the litigation we pursue, and some of the books we sell. We're a modest group, but we think it's an important issue, and certainly it's an issue a lot of people are concerned about today.
Previously, he served as counsel to Senator Patrick Leahy. He's a former chair of the Public Interest Registry, which manages the .org domain. And most interestingly, he is a three-time chess champion for Washington, D.C. Mr. Rotenberg, as always, we appreciate your being on the Communicators. We will be right back with Larry Clinton of the Internet Security Alliance. And now on your screen is Larry Clinton, who is president and CEO of the Internet Security Alliance. Mr. Clinton, if we could start by finding out what the ISA is.
The Internet Security Alliance is a trade association. It was created back in 2000, and it represents virtually every aspect of our nation's critical infrastructure: aviation, banking, communications, defense, education, financial services, etc. And we are, our mission statement is to take advanced technology and blend it with public policy and economics to create a sustainable system of cybersecurity. So we're a security organization, and we represent our company's security interests.
Well, when you look at the cybersecurity proposals put out by the White House this summer, What's your general reaction? Where do you support it? What concerns you?
Well, there are a number of things in the administration's proposal that I think have broad support. Things such as providing more cybersecurity education, developing a much better system within the government to manage their own cybersecurity, research and development on next generation items. I think where we feel that the administration has not met our expectations is when they deal with the private sector. And the private sector owns, operates, and frankly creates the vast majority of what is the internet. And we don't believe that without a robust and really engaged partnership between the public sector and the private sector, we're going to be able to achieve the sort of sustainable system that the Internet Security Alliance is interested in. And so we were disappointed with the entire section, really, that dealt with developing a model for working between the President, the administration, and the private sector.
Why are you disappointed? What specifically disappoints?
Well, so I attended a conference about a month or so ago out at George Mason University, and one of the head White House staff for cybersecurity was giving the keynote address. And at the end of the address, he was asked, so give us the future. What would all this mean? And he said that he believed that by 2012, we will have solved all the cybersecurity problems from 2005. And I thought that was a pretty accurate and candid view of what the administration's proposal does. They are fighting the last war. The model that they are using for dealing with the private sector is largely antiquated. It doesn't really recognize the movement that we have in terms of data moving largely out of the control of individual enterprises and now moving to the cloud. It doesn't really appreciate the advanced nature of some of the really serious threats that we are dealing with, things we call the APT, the Advanced Persistent Threat. That's very sophisticated sorts of attacks, often nation-centered. Instead, it takes up sort of punitive Sarbanes-Oxley kind of approach to the private sector that we think really creates the wrong incentives. And what we really need is a positive engagement with our government partners as opposed to kind of a punitive name and shame model. That's not going to provide the sorts of investment that we really need in order to create a sustainable system of cybersecurity.
And in fact, a quote from the Internet Security Alliance when the proposals first came out, it would be much better if companies were proactively incented so that they wanted to find cyber attackers. If you're subject to some of these name and shame penalties, I think that would be a mistake. What would be proactively incenting a company?
Well, ironically, when President Obama released his cyberspace policy review, which was in in May of 2009, he, in his own document, cited a number of these things. So we're talking about using liability incentives. We're talking about using procurement incentives. The president at that time, this is 2009, suggested that we needed to provide tax incentives. We think that we can also use streamlined regulation. We can do an awful lot more to bring the insurance industry into the cybersecurity equation. What we need to do is get organizations to invest more in cybersecurity, to go a step that is frankly beyond what is demanded by their corporate commercial interests and reach a security level that is the national interest. And those are different things.
Gautam Nagesh of the Hill newspaper.
Thank you. Now, you spoke about the private sector's reaction to the plan. The White House has taken great pains to cast this proposal not as a regulatory model, but as a collaboration with the private sector. But we have heard criticism, such as from Melissa Hathaway, who conducted that cyberspace policy review, that there was not enough private sector input.
Oh,
How does the ISA view, how were your firms contacted? How much input did they have in the formulation of this plan?
Unfortunately, we had virtually no direct involvement in the development of the administration's current regulatory proposal. And by the way, the title is Cybersecurity Regulatory Framework for the Covered Critical Infrastructure Sector. So there's really no doubt that they have proposed here developing a fairly extensive regulatory structure. And again, that is precisely the opposite of what the President himself promised when he released the Cyberspace Policy Review back in 2009, where he said that they were not going to adopt a regulated posture. The private sector, from everything I know, had no input into the development of this proposal, quite different, frankly, than the development of the Cyberspace Policy Review or previously the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which were all created through a partnership model. In fact, the private sector went to great pains to put together a very detailed white paper, bringing together the users, the providers, the civil liberties community on a 33-page detailed paper built on the National Infrastructure Protection Plan and the Cyberspace Policy Review to try to advance the ball moving forward. And we presented that to the administration, and we got a 1-hour meeting, and we asked to see their plan to, you show us yours, we'll show you ours. And we never heard back from them. We didn't see the administration's proposal until they sent it to the Congress.
Now, the administration proposal gives DHS the authority essentially to enforce whatever security standards, which they say will be developed in consultation with industry. As you say, they're threatened penalties. They're saying not criminal sanctions necessarily or civil liability, but as you said, name and shame. They're going to publish the results of security audits in order to incentivize companies. I take it that that's not a enforcement mechanism that the ISAs can get behind.
It's the wrong sorts of incentives. You need to understand what we're dealing with here, with these modern attacks, going back to the notion that we're not dealing with 2005 cybersecurity. We're dealing with, in many instances, these very sophisticated attacks. I mentioned before the advanced persistent threat. This is NFL level attacking, okay? These guys are pros, okay? This is the day job. They're not kids in basements. That's not what we're talking about. These guys are very sophisticated, very well organized, very well funded. They are probably state supported. So for a corporation to be going up against essentially a nation state that is attempting to attack them is similar to, adopt Dick Clark's analogy, it'd be similar to the Pentagon going to U.S. Steel during World War II and saying, well, we think the Germans may attack your steel plants out here in Pennsylvania. You guys should buy some anti-aircraft weaponry and maybe some fighter planes. It's entirely the wrong model. These modern attacks are designed to be stealthy. In the old days, attackers publicized their attacks. Now they go in there and they hide. The idea is that you don't know that you have been attacked. So what the administration's proposal does is provide an incentive not to look. We need to provide incentives for corporations to be redoubling their efforts to find these very, very sophisticated attacks. And if corporations feel that that if they find the attack, they're going to be put up on a website and they're going to get a bunch of negative publicity, their stock price is going to go down, not only don't they have an incentive to look for these successful attacks, but we've provided an incentive for foreign entities to attack these entities, hoping they get discovered and their stock prices go down. These are entirely the wrong incentives. This is a punitive model where we're trying to blame the victims of the attack. What we need is a constructive model where the government tries to find things it can do to encourage and assist American companies to provide the right incentives so that we are enhancing our cybersecurity systems, not blaming people when China is successful attacking them.
Well, but Larry Clinton, don't consumers have the right to know if their personal information from via Sony or whatever has been attacked? Don't they have a right to know that that information has been exploited?
Well, we're talking about two different things here. With respect to sort of consumer breach notification laws, we do support those, certainly. And in fact, that would be an element of the administration's proposal where we have common cause with them. They've proposed that we have a national breach notification law. So, you know, on the personal side, which Mark was talking about before, we would probably be in agreement. But I'm not talking about the the loss of Social Security numbers. I'm talking about the really serious problems that we have, the theft of national secrets, corporate intellectual property, the potential for serious destruction of our nation's critical infrastructure. Those are the sorts of attacks that I think we need to go in and root out. But even if we're going to just confine ourselves to the consumer interests, again, what we should be doing is providing the incentives for companies to go find these things, not for them to turn a blind eye to them. And that's what it's going to turn out to be in a pragmatic world. If the result of your doing an investigation of your system is your stock price is going to go down, it's going to be really hard for us to get boards of directors to fund those sorts of things, and we want them to fund those sorts of things.
Now, I've spoken to cybersecurity experts who will tell you that almost everything of importance has been stolen from American companies online. And if we do want a lot of critical infrastructure firms to take this seriously, some form of, maybe not punitive, but enforcement mechanism is needed beyond incentives. How would the White House ensure adequate urgency from these firms, given that it's widely accepted that the default state of security right now is just not acceptable?
Yeah, and of course the Internet Security Alliance was created 11 years ago specifically to advocate for enhanced cybersecurity. So we've been doing this, we've been advocating for this sort of activity on the part of the Congress and the administration for over a decade. It's just the form of activity that we are differing on, but we welcome the debate. I don't think that the administration's proposal really does anything that I can see to enhance cybersecurity. But I think that there are a number of things that we could do. So let's, there's 1,000 different ways you can divide up cyber attacks. But let's divide it up into two different areas, which I think is useful. One, there are kind of the basic attacks. And basic attacks can be very devastating. But when I say basic, they're kind of the traditional things that we're familiar with, distributed denial of service, those kinds of things. We know tons about how to prevent those basic attacks. In fact, there has been consistent research by the academic community, the private sector, and the government, all agreeing that if we simply adopted the standards, practices, and technologies that we already have, we could stop between 85 and 95% of those attacks. And the reason we don't do it is the reason corporations aren't doing a lot of things: cost. So we have to find ways to make those investments economically viable for the enterprises who we need to be protecting their systems. So that's one thing we could do. And what we have suggested is that if you use liability, insurance, streamlined regulation, procurement, a range of things that the government can do to provide those incentives. And that would address the vast majority of the attacks. On the other hand, we have these ultra-sophisticated attacks that I was talking about before. Now, one of the characteristics of these attacks is the bad guys are going to get in. That's what persistent refers to. They are so persistent, they are going to get in your system. You really have no perimeter defense. So what that means is that we have to alter the model away from perimeter defense to a different strategy. However, we have ways to do this, and we have proposed these. We've proposed them to the government. For example, we don't have a lot of control over the attackers when they're out there in the wild, as we like to say. The internet is too vast, there are too many entry points, et cetera, et cetera. If they want to get in, they're going to get in. But we have a lot more control over them when they're inside our system. So if you do really good internal analysis, you can find them when they're in your network. And most cyber attacks of the sort we're talking about, these really sophisticated ones, aren't successful when they break in. They're successful when they break back out. They're stealing things. So if you lock the thief in the vault, so to speak, so he gets a good look at your money, you really do thwart the attack. So if we can come up with ways to find the websites that they are sending the data back out to and block that unauthorized outbound traffic, even when they succeed in getting inside, we can still thwart the attack. So this is a mechanism that we actually have used, a number of companies have used. It is pretty successful, but it's really costly. Now because to do this kind of sophisticated internal analysis. So what we need to do is develop a new sort of structure where we leverage the companies that really do this well, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, the Raytheons, the Boeings, the guys who do this really well, they're going to invest in this kind of stuff. Flowers.com, they're never going to invest in this kind of stuff. But if we can share the information that the really sophisticated people do about this unauthorized sites, we can actually create a different model of security for these ultra-sophisticated attacks. So what we're advocating is several things. One, to deal with these basic attacks, we have to deal with the core issue, which is economic. It's not that we don't know how to handle security, it's that we don't want to buy security. I'm going to guess that you two, like most people, didn't ask about the security on the smartphones that you bought. You probably asked, how much does it cost and what can it do? That's what we all ask about, me too. Everybody does. It's the same thing with corporations. We have to deal with that economic issue. And then with these ultra-sophisticated things, we have to get the ultra-sophisticated companies, which we have, and leverage their ability so that they will share that information more broadly. And a lot of them are willing to do this. And we have proposed this to the government. And we would love to have a really good constructive engagement where we can develop these sophisticated, enhanced strategies to deal with the sophisticated, enhanced sort of threats.
Final question.
Now, it does sound when you talk about these ultra-sophisticated attacks that you may be indicating that perhaps more intelligence or military involvement is necessary, because obviously there are calls for that, and that is viewed as the alternative to the White House's DHS proposed model, which is that the intelligence agencies would still have a lot of involvement. Is that what your companies are relying on when you're dealing with these more sophisticated attacks?
No, not at all. Obviously, when you're dealing with defense companies, and I mentioned a couple of defense companies, they do a lot of work with the military, but they're not the only ones. Sophisticated banks and others, also do this kind of very sophisticated analysis. Symantec does this kind of sophisticated analysis. So there are a number of other companies. So what we are talking about really is a system that is built on the private sector collaborating with each other and then sharing more broadly with the broad private sector. Now, would there be intelligence agencies involved? I don't envision it. The big problem in cybersecurity with regard to information sharing is trust. And the reason we don't have the trust now is that the intelligence community doesn't want to give up source data because they're afraid that it will get out to the bad guys. And frankly, that's a pretty reasonable thing. And the private sector doesn't want to give up proprietary data because they're afraid it's going to get out to competitors. The model I just described circumvents both of those problems. We're not talking about anymore giving up source data. Most companies don't care who is doing the attack. The government cares that because they want to catch them. Most companies, they don't care about that. They just want the attack stopped. So simply by changing the model of the sort of information we're sharing, we can stop this without getting much more involvement from the intelligence community, et cetera. And I'm offering this just as an example. What I'm saying is when we are dealing with the basic attacks, there's lots we already know, and we need to be incentivizing that. We want these companies to want to do it. If you try a regulatory model, they'll be resistant to doing it. On the other hand, with the sophisticated attacks, we need to evolve our thinking about defensive strategies in a variety of different ways, one of which I've shared with you. But I don't think that this necessitates the sort of broad involvement of our military structure in our critical infrastructure. I think the ISA would be opposed to that.
Larry Clinton is the president and CEO of the Internet Security Alliance. Gautam Nagesh, technology reporter with the Hill newspaper. Gentlemen, thank you. Next week, the conclusion of our series on cybersecurity. We have three cybersecurity experts talking about some of the threats that the U.S. faces. Alan Poller of the SANS Institute, Catherine Lotrianti of Georgetown University, and Jim Lewis of CSIS. We'll see you next week.